all three of our speakers? I see them. Yes. Great to see you. So I think we can just switch on this one. Dan, great to meet you.
Hey. Oh, hey, Steve. Good to see you. Here you go. Okay,
I guess as we're getting settled in, I should note that the last time Just Track asked me to take a leading role in a panel, about 5 minutes in, we had a fire alarm, and the building had to evacuate just as I was asking a provocative question. So hopefully we will proceed uninterrupted today, or at least for this session. So thank you all. During this session, we will explore holistic approaches to rule of law promotion and assistance activities. Now, I expect this is not necessarily a new or an unfamiliar topic for many of you in this room. At least I think it was the 60 or so that have experience working in the area of rule of law, and that's because there has been considerable emphasis placed on holistic approaches as this field has evolved and professionalized over time. I personally believe that the holistic approach is one of the field's first significant advancements or improvements, and maybe indeed even an innovation. On the conceptual side, we can look back to the seminal report of the UN Secretary General in 2004 on the rule of law, which underscored the importance of taking an integrated and a comprehensive approach to rule of law. Several years later, in 2010, the UN also set forward a series of guiding principles on rule of law assistance. Chief among them included taking note of the political context, ensuring effective partnerships, also taking and tailoring assistance to the unique country contexts and capabilities and needs, and then, most germane to this panel, ensuring a coherent and comprehensive strategic approach to rule of law. For its part, USAID also emphasizes the holistic, the comprehensive, and the strategic approach to rule of law. And here I would refer you to our 2010 Guide to Rule of Law Country Analysis. INL, for its part, we could look to their 2013 Guide to Justice Sector Reform, which emphasizes taking a whole-of-system approach as a guiding principle of its work. And then we can also look most recently, late last year, the USIP, in publishing its Guide to Rule of Law Cultures, included an entire chapter on systems or a systemic approach to rule of law. So we have invested in trying to conceptualize and define what we mean by a holistic approach. And then I think as practitioners, also over the last decade, I think we are demonstrating a more holistic version or understanding of what we mean by justice. So it's not just the retributive forms of justice and criminal accountability, prosecuting people, but it's also for violation of state laws, but it's also about restorative forms of justice and also reparative forms of justice. I think as a field, we are also taking a better understanding or developing a better understanding of the linkages between justice and security, and learning how to engage and work with the various institutions and actors and processes that make up the so-called justice chain. And here I would point not just to the formal, but also the informal actors in both justice and security. And then we're also strengthening, I believe, as a field in the context of holistic approaches, developing this understanding, as I alluded to earlier, the relationship between rule of law and other development sectors. So it's the economic growth, the health issues, and also the environment. And in this regard, I have to point out that the recently adopted Sustainable Development Goals includes a goal on access to justice and rule of law, and in effect puts justice, I would suggest, right at the heart of the development agenda through 2030, in a way that the previous Millennium Development Goals did not do. So what we want to do this morning is really begin to unpack the holistic, comprehensive, and systems approaches to rule of law as a concept, focusing on more of the practical and the programmatic, what it looks like and what it entails in practice, and what are some of the innovative ways we can do that. And we're very fortunate to have with us 3 experts that are going to help us do that. You have the bios, I believe, in your packet, so we don't want to spend that time, or our time today. But we do have, we have met by phone. So this is the first time we've met together. So
Ben Roth.
it's Ben Roth, Yinho Verdeshat, and Professor, Chris Janczyk. Okay, Jakonik. So instead of asking my colleagues to introduce themselves, what I would like to do to get us started is to have them introduce very briefly an aspect of their work, a program that takes a holistic approach. So we can just go down the line.
Sure. My name is Ben Roth, and I am an immigration scholar. So I come at this, I guess, from a different starting point. Basically, what I'm going to talk to you today about is the work that we're just on the cusp of starting, taking a harder look at the data coming out of an impact evaluation of the Central American Regional Security Initiative, CARSI, in the Northern Triangle, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. And I come to this as an immigration scholar because, as such, I ask questions about push and pull factors that influence the flow of people crossing borders. And so on the state side, we look a lot at pull factors, but push factors really came to the fore several years ago when, as President Obama declared it a humanitarian crisis at our border emerged with the crossing of tens and thousands of unaccompanied minors. And so these young people, primarily from the Northern Triangle, were found by UNHCR and others to be driven, push factors, in part by neighborhood-based violence, gang activity, fear, and other factors that were destabilizing their neighborhoods and really their developmental trajectories. And so this then invited a series of questions and eventually a collaboration with the USAID mission in El Salvador to take a harder look at one aspect of CARSI. CARSI is a multi-pronged initiative. One part of CARSI has to do with looking at iron fist approach or sort of looking more specifically at enhancing policing and the effectiveness of policing, justice system more broadly in this region in order to stabilize and deter outmigration of individuals. The second half is preventative in nature. It's looking more specifically at social and economic development with the understanding that, and to the point of this panel, I believe, a holistic approach must not only attend to the questions of justice, but also creating opportunities for those who, in the case of young people, are looking for indications that there is a future, that there are opportunities, that there's a reason to stay. And so that's primarily where my comments are going to come from today is, again, as an immigration scholar and as someone who's at the very front end of a data collection effort in El Salvador and drawing on some of what we see and the data that has been done by, or the impact evaluation that's been conducted by Vanderbilt on the CARSI initiative.
Okay, thank you, Andrew, and good morning, everyone. I work at an organization called the Hague Institute for the Innovation of Law. And we see ourselves more or less as an R&D institute for the justice sector, and also as a place where we accelerate justice innovations that usually emerge bottom up. And I think what is central to the approach that we have at Hill is that we always start listening to the citizens. And one of the first things that we always do is we we conduct a justice needs and satisfaction survey, and that's basically a household survey where we ask 10,000 people of a certain population, what are the legal problems that you've experienced in the past years? What actions did you take? What support people did you have around you? What was the level of justice broken down in several indicators that you experienced from these? What were the costs that you incurred? What were the level of stress, the non-monetary costs that you incurred? And also, what was the effectiveness? To what extent was the problem that you had solved? And I think what we see from the data that we collect through these justice need and satisfaction surveys always is that rule of law, be it in a holistic approach or differently, in the perception of citizens, very often comes down to a bundle of tasks that they need to perform in order to get their legal problem solved. And for these tasks, they need several things. They need very objective, reliable, understandable information. Sometimes they need a lawyer, but sometimes, and even more often, which comes to no surprise to the people in this audience, I guess, they go to someone who is more near to them. You'll find that teachers at a school play a very important part in the justice process that people go through, or local chief, and these are very important actors for them. So when we listen to the citizens' voices and we have identified the needs and the satisfaction with the support processes around them, we can start to innovate. So, for example, family problems are very often a problem with very high frequency. So what you can do next is redesign or look at the family law procedures. You have identified the bottlenecks and try to find new ways for organizing these procedures. And you do that, and that's where innovation comes in, I think, by opening up the design process, not only to lawyers, but to social psychologists or to informal actors that are around, or give the citizens a voice in the design process. And increasingly, we ask IT developers or user experience designers and all those fancy new type of jobs that are very alien to rule of law designing to become a part of that. And in that way, you can start redesigning legal procedures from a citizen's perspective, and that's what we typically do at Hill. But we also think that from this process, there may come very good ideas, but there are others out there in a certain country who might have better ideas. So I think that really can help innovation for this process is to open up challenges, to invite people, young entrepreneurs, lawyers, people from the judiciary to come up with their own ideas and to open up this challenge, have a clear set of criteria to evaluate the submissions that you have and pick the best ones and help them to accelerate, to scale up, which obviously is one of the biggest challenges that we always see for these things. And in order to do that, one of the things that we see at Hill as being very much needed in order for this to be effective is that you need to have the support of leadership, because these innovative approaches, they typically require some space for experiments, and they typically require a slight increase of tolerance for failure, because when you try to innovate, you have to prepare that things will go wrong, maybe half of the time, maybe even further, but you're looking for the diamonds. I think in this country they call them unicorns. So that's the type of process that we facilitate at Hill. We do this globally. We work a lot in countries like Kenya, Uganda, Tunisia, or Jordan, Mali. We've worked in Yemen, Indonesia, but also in England, in Canada, in the US, and we see that this more citizen-centered approach, there's a lot of lessons to be learned, not only from the north to the south, and from the south to the south, but even from the south to the north. And I think I just recently found out that the OSF is also exploring whether or not to implement their legal empowerment approach for the legal aid situation in the United States, which I think is a very good example of the type of south-north learning that can take place. So that's the perspective where I come from. Thank you.
Chris?
Great, thank you. Before I start, I just have to make a comment on that polling technology, which I love. It's my first exposure to it, and I always thought it would be interesting if an audience could weigh in about whether they're enjoying a particular speaker, for example. And if the negatives outweigh the positives, something would have to be done. But I'm not suggesting it for this panel, but something to think about in the future. So I work with an organization called Landesa. I'm fairly new to Landesa, actually. I used to work in the broader field of human rights and development. And what really attracted me to Landesa was just how central land is to almost everything that the development field is trying to resolve. And that has to do with the fact that most poor people living in the developing world share three basic traits. They live in rural areas, they depend on land, and they don't have secure rights to that land. And land is really their greatest asset. That's their gateway to so many other issues, both economic and political. And economics is fairly obvious once you start working in this field, that if a person feels secure about their land, they're liable to invest in their land. They can use the land as collateral. They have enough security to think about the long term, and both for themselves and conserving the forests and so forth. And by the same token, if they don't have the land, they are left in a very insecure and marginal situation. They will scavenge often, and they lack a certain political voice or political rights, which is particularly critical for women. And so our land rights work has always been, I shouldn't say always, but is very much mixed with women's rights in particular, because it's so critical to them. And then to the broader society, land is vital to things like peace and stability, rule of law for sure, conservation efforts, development efforts. It's very hard to rebuild after humanitarian crises when you don't have secure land rights and the like. So land is just essential. And the insecurity of land is massive. It's not a problem that we're really familiar with in the developed world, in the North. We just assume we have these land rights, and so I can buy and sell my house, so I can use it however I want. But in the developing world, Africa, for example, the World Bank tells us that 90% of the land in Africa is not formally titled, and people don't have secure rights. So that's 90%. In India, it's something like 60 or 70% of the farmers don't have secure rights to their land. It's a massive problem. And so Landesa has been working on this issue now for about 50 years in over 50 countries. And initially our work was very much a formal policy-focused intervention. We would go from country to country flying in and advising governments about ways that they could improve their laws to ensure greater legal rights and security to mostly smallholder farmers, women, and the like. But then about 20 years ago, Landesa broadened its scope and started looking at the thornier questions and longer-term questions of implementation. And that has really put us at the center of these questions of holistic legal reform. And I want to talk a bit about that, but just to finish off here, the issues of insecurity that we struggle with have something to do with the formal law, but really it's the informal issues that are so challenging. And so in most developing countries, you will find that the formal legal system is only one piece of the picture, that there is side by side with that customary norms, traditional ways of doing it, tribal authorities who exercise equal or more weight on questions like land. And so figuring out how to address those kinds of questions has been at the forefront of what Landesa has been trying to do, and I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that.
Okay. As moderator or panelist, wearing two hats, I've also been asked to discuss and reference a case study or a particular program in this context of holistic approaches. And in that regard, I would just make reference to a USAID program that was undertaken between 2010 and 2015 in Indonesia, the so-called Changes for Justice program, which was actually designed to sustain the results and impact of 3 previous rule of law programs in that country, focused on the efficiency, the effectiveness, and accountability with the Indonesian justice system. So in a holistic way, this program included components that focused on strengthening the judiciary, particularly the Supreme Court, also the Attorney General's office, and then focusing on issues of access to justice and legal aid. And in this way, I think it did take a comprehensive or systems-oriented approach to the system. I think it was also somewhat holistic in that while the program was designed after the Indonesians had adopted a so-called blueprint for judicial reform, I think it was about a 25-year plan, the program was actually tied to this strategic or this blueprint for reform, which in and of itself was both multidimensional and holistic. And then lastly, this program was somewhat unique in that it adopted or developed a so-called biodiversity program that focused on illegal logging, wildlife trafficking, and so-called economic crimes, which implicated issues of corruption as well as money laundering, and also even human trafficking issues. And of course, it tied back to the issues of land and many of the needs that individuals have vis-a-vis their land and their natural resources. So we'll make references throughout our panel to our different programs. But before we do that, we want to now engage you and get more of your input using this so-called poll everywhere application. So the first question that we'd like to bring up on the screen for you is, what is the first thing that comes to mind when you think of taking a holistic approach to rule of law programming? There we go. And this really can be a word or a phrase describing a concept, an activity, a resource, or something that you think is particularly innovative in this context of holistic approaches. Okay, well, while that loads, I'll then turn to my panelists, and I'd like to explore a little bit in more detail what we mean by the holistic approach, and perhaps looking at some of these issues, what are the essential elements of taking a holistic approach to rule of law programming, and what are the innovative ways that we can do that? I mean, is taking a holistic approach still innovative, or how can we improve it? So, Chris, why don't we start with you and come back this way?
I'm kind of tempted just to read off the backdrop there. That's another great way to do a panel, just have the audience provide the answers. So I would say a holistic approach is, in some ways, in my mind at least, it's set up in opposition to more top-down traditional approaches, which have tended to be somewhat formalistic and maybe Western and a bit myopic in nature, at least. Maybe that's being a little too tough on it, but that was certainly my legal education back in the 90s, and I think the whole law and development movement suffered a bit from that. And so a holistic approach would be much more sensitive to context, would recognize that the answers have to come from the local needs and behaviors and customs. And I thought your approach is spot on, that it would start with surveying folks at the local level to really get a sense of what are the critical obstacles. So coming in with an open mind and not a lot of presumptions. And then trying to build local ownership, both amongst the citizens and the bureaucrats or the government. I'd say those are all critical elements, and that's in some ways defines how Landesa has evolved in the way we've dealt with these rule of law issues.
Yeah, I think a holistic approach for me always is complementary to focusing on building the formal institutions, but at the same time acknowledging that, and speaking from a private law orientation and maybe a slight European perspective. At the same time, acknowledging that the institutions that we have in place in our own countries are not really working for the entirety of the population as we speak. Coming from the Netherlands, but I see this happening in Western Europe and in many other countries. We see that about 50% of people who experience a legal problem, they lump it, or they will at least never go to a lawyer. About 10% of these people will end up in court in the end. So for me, this also is an indication that building these formal institutions will not have the impact, the widespread impact that we envisage it to have. And thus, it becomes important to identify the routes to justice that people tend to follow. And that means that, as I mentioned, informal actors will appear. And we all have many concerns about maybe the legitimacy or the level of justice that these informal actors deliver to people, and the widespread corruption that also takes place at that level. But I think if we do that, then the questions become different, because then we can ask ourselves the question as part of this holistic approach. How can we intervene, or how can we reform, or how can we bring more neutrality at that level, and how can we find ways to integrate the decisions of a local chief and link it somehow to the courts or to the laws that we have. And increasingly, I think I already mentioned this, I see the opportunity of technology really offering a lot of potential here, because with technology you can create transparency. You can, for example, start thinking of designing platforms where all of these actors and these professionals, whether they are informal or formal, will plug into or log into. And you can think of internet technology, but you can also very easily think of SMS technology as a very suitable alternative for that. So I think that latter part for me is not a definitional part of holistic approaches, but I do see that it offers huge potential. Yeah.
So I guess I don't know that I can add to the conversation about the essential ingredient of what a holistic approach would be. And although I would say that maybe just as a model suggests a set of a Venn diagram or a set of a recipe, necessary ingredients that you need in order to get this thing called a holistic approach, I would just caution against I guess two things. One, that we do that at the cost of remaining flexible. And I think both the emphasis on sort of the informal, the sort of informal laws or the mores and the sort of the aspects of rule of law that we may not necessarily notice because they're not written on paper when we enter a particular context, as well as the informal leaders that Jin Ho mentioned, suggest that there are things that are essential, perhaps, to certain contexts to effectively accomplishing a holistic approach that we may not have thought of because our model doesn't contain it, doesn't identify it. And so this requires, given the informal, a sort of a stylized ability to flex our model to adapt to a given situation. And the second is, just as technology is not static, neither should our model or our understanding of a holistic approach. We can't have a sort of, we've got it. Here are the ingredients. Here's the model. Here's the report, the glossy. Rather, we need to understand a holistic approach as something that needs to be dynamic, and that I don't have any. I mean, this isn't rocket science, right? But I think as we enter in this conversation, I don't think that we can be searching for that fixed model which will, across all contexts, accomplish the things that we're hoping to accomplish. Rather, we need to keep in mind that this model needs to be flexible and dynamic along the way.
I think those are really important points, including the formal and the informal, this flexibility and dynamic and being responsive as the situation changes. And I think the data and the monitoring comes into play there. Just real quick, in terms of thinking holistically about institution building, which is one type of activity that's common to rule of law, and USAID and I know INL, we do focus a lot on institution building. So thinking holistically about building an institution, and by this I mean the justice, the judiciary, for instance, or the prosecutors. In some of our programs, including in this Indonesia program, we take the institution and look at how do we improve its capabilities and capacities, including the people that work in it on the technical side. So we do focus on, in a holistic way, building up the expertise of judges, of prosecutors, of other justice sector actors on the law, on performing their job in a professional and a way that is respectful of ethics and integrity. But then also we have to look at the institution and building up the administrative side. The operational side. So it's about judges not only sitting and presiding over cases, but the role of judges or prosecutors and others in administering their institutions, and then building up the staff, whether it's through standard operating procedures and other forms of capacity building that look at public administration. And we were doing this in Indonesia, and we're doing it in other countries, including Mali right now. So it's the public financial management, the budgeting issues, and also the procurement and the human resources issues. So when we think about how do we create a more effective and efficient and responsive justice sector institution, we are looking at both the individual technical capabilities as well as the administrative ones. So we talked a little bit about some of the tools and the approaches, including technology and I think and surveys, but that's really I was hoping we could drill into that a little bit more and ask the panelists to talk in a little bit more detail about, to the extent that there are innovative tools in taking, or techniques in taking a holistic approach or ensuring that we are capturing we have a better sense of the need and integrating those needs into our programming. What type of tools do we really have? Is there any standardized tools, or do we need to be more innovative in our tools? You talked a little bit about technology. A lot of lip service is paid to technology. Perhaps you could begin there. How does technology really help us think and act holistically?
I can give you one example of the use of SMS and internet technology that's currently being done in Kenya. I think some of you might be aware of the fact that Kenya is the cradle of M-Pesa, which is basically mobile money, and we're running behind of that because everyone's paying with their cell phone there. And I think, at least in Europe, hardly anyone is doing that, whereas it has clear advantages over using a card. But there, we found that in many slum areas and in many rural areas, there is an informal mechanism in place, as I mentioned, and this is working to some extent. However, as mentioned, the norms that are being used right there, they are problematic in a way, but we see there a lot of facilitators or paralegals who are not really lawyers, but they take up a hybrid role where they mediate between people and where they sometimes find ways to impose a certain decision on the basis of their own norms. At least that's what you hope as a minimum. But the challenge there is to bring legal information that can be applied by these people in those contexts. And obviously, these people who are local people grew up in the slums and somehow gained this position. These people, they don't have the money and maybe not the skills to go to law school for 4 years. So that's a challenge, but the information is out there, namely the lawyers in the business districts who are in the law firms there, they know what these legal norms are and what legal norms are supposed to be applied. So what has happened in Nairobi is the development of a system called mHaki, and Haki is the Kiswahili word for justice. And with that, basically an interface or a platform has been created by which the facilitators living in Kibera slum, for example, they can text message their questions about the law by using a 20-year-old Nokia telephone. And this question emerges on a website where, on a daily basis, about 50 lawyers will browse the questions that came in behind their laptops, sitting in their law firms in the business district. Now, for these lawyers, they don't have to pick up a telephone or they don't have to travel to the slum, but they can just, at their own convenience, at the time that's convenient for them, log into the website, see what questions are out there, and answer the ones that they find easy to answer. And after they've done that, they hit the enter button. This information is sent by text message again to the 20-year-old Nokia telephone of the paralegal who had submitted the question. Now, in that way, the logistical problem of legal information can be solved. And the big challenge, of course, is how can you train paralegals to ask the right type of questions, and how can you train lawyers not to be too lawyerly in their answers? And I think the latter is a bigger challenge than the former. But and that's a trial and error thing. But in that way, technology is used to just disseminate information. And what the good thing about this is that the quality of the information is transparent because it's on the platform, and for the organization who is hosting it, it becomes possible to also assess the quality of the information. And an additional upside, from my perspective at least, is that these facilitators all of a sudden offer a different type of value. And we see emerge that some of them are trying to transform themselves in what I would call respectfully a slum law firm, where they charge their clients a small fee for the services that they provide. And in return, they are the dispute resolution facilitators that are just around the corner. And I think that also could offer the beginning of an answer to how can we get these types of technologies running in a more sustainable manner. So I think that's for me, that's a very powerful example of how technology can basically solve a seemingly small challenge.
Ben, could I ask you also to discuss any type of innovative tools or techniques that you're using or you've used or you're familiar with in this developing a holistic approach, or whether it's assessment methodologies, surveys, and the use of survey data that could go towards both designing and ensuring in terms of including people that we are taking a more holistic approach?
So unfortunately, I guess my immediate thought goes actually to why this is difficult to do, why it's hard to effectively address this question. And in the case of CARSI, one challenge with the preventative aspect of CARSI is that they aimed to have a rigorous evaluation in place, and they succeeded in doing so. Vanderbilt, together with USAID and some others, they randomly selected, randomly assigned the treatment to certain neighborhoods, and had control neighborhoods that shared similar characteristics as their treatment neighborhoods. In every way, had an RCT set up that met the rigor of sort of basic scientific standards. However, because they were going to be sending in individuals to assess the effectiveness of the treatment in these neighborhoods, they knew that they couldn't select neighborhoods that were at the greatest risk. That is, they knew from the outset that selecting the highest violent neighborhoods for the intervention would put their evaluators at risk. And so they chose not to do that. And it makes perfect sense, right? But this is some of the hard choices that face those who are about the task of rigorously evaluating a holistic program. And so this is a challenge. Also, on the ground, one aspect of the preventative aspect of CARSI were these youth outreach centers, which, if anyone in this room knows about the youth outreach centers within CARSI, I would be pleasantly surprised, just because it is a small aspect of a very expensive intervention. And yet in many ways, the youth outreach centers represent some of the quintessential elements that we're discussing here. They emerge from local communities. They involve informal actors, informal leaders. They take the shape of the communities in which they are embedded. And yet, what we see with the rigorous and very well done evaluation conducted by the Latin American Public Opinion Project out of Vanderbilt of the CARSI initiative is that while we're able to see that the neighborhoods that received the treatment, this multi-pronged intervention of CARSI, showed signs of having an increased perception of security. The residents of these neighborhoods felt less fear. There were fewer incidents, violent incidents in these communities. But we don't know why. So we know that it worked, but we don't necessarily, it remains somewhat of a black box. In part because the multiple programs that comprise such a big initiative did not themselves all receive a rigorous evaluation. And so this left unanswered certain questions. And I know that Eric Olson and his team here at the Wilson Center have really done a great job of critically looking at CARSI. So I'm borrowing this from some of those authors that this is one of the shortcomings of taking a technological, and by technology I'm not referring to smartphones as much as I am to intelligent and carefully thought out scientific evaluation. By taking technology and applying it to the situation, it has its limits. And so we need to be careful about how we sort of aggrandize this a sophisticated evaluative approach to a holistic intervention if we aren't also going to be attending to some of the smaller elements of that intervention, such as the youth outreach centers, which themselves did not receive a rigorous evaluation. And therefore, while they represent some of those key components of what we might think of as being a sort of grassroots and of the people aspect of a security initiative, we don't know whether or to what extent they worked. And so this isn't, and spending time with people on the ground, there's some things that I'll mention about that these centers in particular that I think are really important for us to understand and think about. The point is that technology can only go so far, and at some point we need to be looking beyond survey methodologies and randomly assigned treatment to certain types of neighborhoods, and make sure that we are carefully considering as well whether some of those core aspects of our intervention are also getting the assessment that they need, so that we can walk away at the end of the day and say, yeah, it worked, and here's how. So that as we think about replication, as we think about scaling up, we have the data that necessary at hand to be able to do so effectively.
Chris, do you want to chime in on
Sure.
any of the specific techniques or
Yeah,
tools?
yeah. Great. So a bigger point first, and then it'll help frame some of our interventions. It's critical to understand or appreciate the role of law as really being embedded within power relationships. And rule of law can do lots of good, but it can also empower those folks that are already powerful. And so one of the dangers of an approach that is too formal or too focused on, let's say, top-down, is that you are improving systems and empowering people who already benefit from a disproportionate level of power. And so you are increasing inequities and increasing marginalization rather than addressing them. And so when we intervene at Landesa, we are thinking about both the formal law and how important it is to get rights for marginalized communities, women, smaller farmers, and the like embedded in the law. But we're also thinking about how do we ensure that the clients or the ultimate beneficiaries, the people that will actually use these systems, are also empowered in the process. And that's critical for many reasons. We need them if we're going to address these problems systemically and long term. We need that constituency. We need to build that demand for the legal services or for the law. And in some ways, we can think about this as both a supply and demand issue, the supply being what the government offers and the institutions and the laws, and the demand being, are people aware of their rights? Are they engaged in the process? Are they able to vindicate them in some ways without having to wait on an expensive urban-based lawyer and an impossibly complex legal system? Or can they engage them at their local level and in a day-to-day fashion? So one of the interventions that has worked well for us, it's still something of a pilot project, is in India. I was going to talk Africa, but I'm going to talk India for this particular example. In Telangana, we have worked with communities there to try to understand what are the legal obstacles to them holding secure land title, or at least perceiving that they have some security. And the perception is almost as critical as the reality, because if you don't perceive yourself as having secure land title, you're not likely to make the investments or take the extra steps to improve your income or your livelihoods or the like. And so we work with communities to select a member of their community who we then train, and these are usually students without a lot of education, but enough that they can understand some of the basics of the legal of land rights. And we will train them in 6-week courses and then send them back to their community where they will do a survey of all the different households to try to understand what are the legal impediments. And we have a list of 75 different issues that they will look at. And by doing that, we are making sure that we're empowering somebody from the community, we're engaging the community, and hopefully we are addressing land rights from the perspective of the community and not simply the perspective of an outdated land registry or a government official that may be corrupt or not, but we are trying to engage the community in the process. So that system, it's very low cost. It means that Landesa will have a small presence in a region just to do the initial training, and then we're there to answer some questions. And usually it's not Landesa from Seattle or DC, it's Landesa India. That one has worked very well in terms of generating enormous amounts of data, and then getting those we call them CRPs, community resource people, which are like quasi paralegals or grassfoot lawyers. Grassfoot, is that the word? Barefoot.
Grass-fed.
Yeah, grass-fed. The barefoot lawyers, to then engage with government officials in a sort of a partnership to address some of the systemic legal issues that stand in the way of people gaining more secure land rights. And that's a system that I think could work very nicely with the kind of technology that Dr. Jim was talking about, because being able to supplement the training of those local community persons with some kind of in the moment question and answer would be, I think, tremendously valuable. And so I think this offers the human side, or at least addressing one piece of the puzzle on the human side that could then work very nicely with some of the technological advances.
Chris, you mentioned the demand and supply side sort of construct. So I guess for all of you, does taking a holistic approach to rule of law, to justice, really require addressing both the demand and the supply side? Can we focus on one without focusing on the other? And if we do so, does that create tensions? So for instance, investing in developing the capacity of civil society organizations or communities to understand their rights, to expect and demand from whether it's the land officials or the justice officials or mediators, services that they're not capable of delivering because they aren't competent enough, they don't have the resources, et cetera. Are we creating tensions there? How do we mitigate that? If anybody has any insight into that, sort of focusing on both elements or just one?
No, I think you really need both, because if you're taking a holistic approach, in my belief, you will always need a centralized norm-setting institution, for example, when you're talking about legal procedures, for example. Now, what you need to organize is you need those norms to trickle down, and that's where the complementarity and the holistic approach probably comes in place. But I think having a legitimate authority for certain aspects like norm creation always will remain essential. And for that you need some kind of court hierarchy that is functioning well, that has well-trained judges in place, that resides in decent buildings. One example I can give about that is I had some conversations with the former Chief Justice of Kenya, and he was always complaining about the fact that many of their court files always seem to get lost. So many court staff, while preparing a court case, they would always come and say, "Sorry, we lost the file." And it took them about 2 months before they found out that many of these court files, they were hidden in the basement of the courts. But the situation was that in these basements, not only the court files were present, but there were a lot of snakes, a lot of rats, a lot of other nasty animals, and none of these people dared to go inside. So you need to have some kind of decent infrastructure, physical infrastructure, always, I think. So yeah, I really see that they should complement each other and not crowd each other out.
Yeah, please.
Well, I think that's true. You have to have both sides. But I would say that if you were going to focus on one or the other, I would strongly push the demand side, because I feel like the supply side has been in vogue for a long time. It's the easier side. It gets most of the attention and the resources, despite all the good talk about holistic approaches. And the demand side is messier. It's political. It's tough. It requires a lot of collaboration that we know is always tricky. And so I would say I would put my money and efforts, of course you have to have both, but I'd put more resources into the demand side, because I think disproportionately it has suffered traditionally, and getting the demand right is often a first step towards getting the supply right, whereas I don't think the opposite is true. That if you get the supply side right, I don't think that necessarily is going to solve your problems, because oftentimes you can have a fairly well-working legal system that's only accessed by the elites of a country, and most of the other folks who are marginalized will suffer the consequences of that. Whereas if you can engage people and help them understand their rights and bring them along, and build their investment in the legal system in a way that engages with it, I can only see that as ultimately helping build stronger legal systems. And so I do think there's a slight difference between the two sides in that respect.
So we've referenced, our panelists have referenced different types of populations, different people that make up society. And so we want to just explore this, who we should be engaging in this context of taking a holistic approach. So again, we'd like to now get your input using the poll everywhere technology. But I think many of us are all too familiar when we are working in the field of meeting with the so-called usual suspects, speaking with people that know how to speak with us, who may hold rather conventional views and parochial views that don't necessarily reflect society and the needs of different diverse needs of society. So we're having this conversation over and over, and we're trying to figure out how do we develop a holistic program that, while addressing maybe perhaps all members of society, still looks at some of the particular, those members of society that have particular needs. So I guess when we are undertaking assessments, who should we be talking to? So the question we have is, what stakeholders, beyond the usual suspects, should be included in a holistic approach to rule of law programming? And I saw some of that up, some relevant answers to this question in the previous response, including religious leaders. Yes. So as we know, it's often quoted, women can make up some 50%, perhaps more, of the population. But in addition to women, who else should we be talking to? Should we just be sitting down with ministry officials, the same civil society organizations? Are we being creative enough in who we're speaking with? And who should we be speaking with? Okay, well, I would just then pose that to our panelists. Then, are we doing a good enough job in truly engaging society in a holistic way to understand the justice dynamic or the justice needs, and who should we be speaking to perhaps more?
I think one of the lessons that was learned by USAID in the course of implementing the prevention aspect of CARSI, specifically the youth outreach centers, was that they needed to bring some unexpected actors to the table in order for those to be successful. And in order to do that, they first needed to acknowledge the fact that some of the key actors who they would like to have at the table just weren't going to be there, namely the municipal elected officials in the local communities where they were founding these outreach centers, at least initially, because there was such reluctance among elected officials, municipal leaders at the time, when these youth outreach centers first began in El Salvador, that this prevention approach was a valuable investment of their time and their resources. That is, they saw that the more the enhanced policing was a more reliable way to deal with gang violence and community violence in these municipalities, which is understandable. So rather than start with municipal leaders, what they did is they started with the institutions, local institutions, where they knew that that trust would be naturally cohere. They started with the churches. And they found religious leaders in these communities who would be willing to form committees that would oversee the launch of the youth outreach centers, with the understanding that these religious leaders would then represent to the community a face of trust and safety, which is the very thing that they were trying to instill in the ambiance of these youth outreach centers. But then they had to make the decision about where to locate them. And so I get that this is very nuanced, and these examples are not big picture. But I think they symbolize something of the larger task and when we go about holistic interventions. They also had the spatial question of where to locate these youth outreach centers. And part of the problem was that a municipal administrative boundary was often carved out into specific gang territories. And their thinking initially was to locate the youth outreach centers in the DMZ, if you will, in the neutral zone, the sort of the straddling these gang boundaries, with the hope that youth on each side of this boundary would then access the youth outreach center, a place that was designed to provide them with developmental opportunities, access to computers and training, and really a gateway to technical schools and other opportunities that they hoped would begin to provide some additional developmental opportunities for these kids. But that didn't work. It didn't work to locate the youth centers on the boundaries of straddling two different gang boundaries. What they found is that kids wouldn't come. They were afraid of what that would symbolize to their peers who were gang involved. And so they had to make some hard decisions about where to locate. But they also realized that they needed to bring an unlikely actor to the table, the gangs themselves. They needed to essentially get authorization from the gangs to locate these youth outreach centers in a given community in order to provide a safe place for youth so that they wouldn't get involved with the very gangs who were then authorizing the launch of these centers. And this didn't necessarily endear them to the municipal officials, right? Because there's a fine line between getting quote unquote permission from local gangs to start this center, and partnering with these gangs to do so. And so I think in this on the ground in the nitty-gritty of implementing a holistic, in this case, a preventative aspect of rule of law intervention, it is not altogether clear. And the progression of these youth centers has evolved considerably, and now many municipal officials are on a committee that oversees the youth outreach center in their particular area. But the path to getting where they are was not obvious, and one that I think, in conversation with individuals in El Salvador who are part of this launch, is something that they had to kind of figure out as they went along. So unlikely actors included some people who weren't at the table who should have been, and some people who were, who they found surprised that they had invited at all.
You have anything?
Yeah, I think I would like to add one thing to this, and it also gets back to one of the things that you just mentioned, Ben, that it's not a one-off thing. I had these conversations. I thought one of the questions also showed the word agile, which was provided by one of you, and I think agile also implying to have a continuous development cycle is extremely important. So in addition to the question, who should be part of the conversation, I think it's also extremely important to just continue the conversation even after implementation. One example I can give from Kenya again is the establishment of court user committees that most of the courts in Kenya have done. And what this does is basically every 2 months the court leadership invites all the different users of their court to come for a conversation. And this includes the lawyers, this includes people who were just as citizens part of a case, prosecution, NGOs who populate the courts, police, and all the but also the clerks and the other staff that they had. And with them, in a more or less focus group setting, they reflect on things that could be improved in their court day-to-day processes. And I think the fact that these courts open up to the input of all the different types of users and not focusing on the legal aspects only, I think shows great value in just continuing these dialogues with probably many of the actors that are displayed on the screen right now.
Just a quick comment, but on this, the use of so-called court user committees or other types of feedback mechanisms, I think we can build them, these as widgets or as things, but it also requires, I would suggest, an innovation in mindset. Because we're asking many people who aren't typically disposed or experienced in engaging in a serious dialogue with the users, with those who they are working with judges, prosecutors, et cetera. So we can create outreach, we can create public information centers like they've done in the Indonesia program, but really effectuating a real serious dialogue, getting that feedback, and then having people not only change their minds but change their behavior is an ongoing challenge, I think. Chris.
So I was going to talk a little bit about our programs in Kenya and Rwanda, where we have worked closely with women's organizations. In the case of Kenya, we were trying to bridge the gap between the formal constitutional rights that were rooted in constitutional reform from 2010 with the tribal authorities who were both brought in under and recognized by the Constitution but had not moved far enough in terms of women's rights. And so to bridge that gap, we worked with local partners and with women from the community to create a dialogue with the tribal authorities in various communities to talk about the new rights from the Constitution that both empowered these tribal authorities but also empowered women. And that dialogue proved to be very successful, not only around land rights, but around broader political voice and community, political in the context of the community, political rights for the women. In Rwanda, we worked with, again, women's organizations to train mediators, women mediators who would travel by motorcycle or motorbike or other local transportation to communities to help resolve problems because women who suffered land rights problems, which is quite common because they don't have a lot of legal authority informally, were subject to panels of male-dominated or exclusively male panels to resolve these conflicts. And so finding an informal third party to travel to the villages and help mediate these conflicts required working with these women's organizations and was quite successful. But I wanted to also mention that in India, we have worked with local government programs that serve certain parts of the community around education and food security and tacked on a land rights component. And this is sort of what we call a convergence model where microplots is part of the program where the government will distribute microplots, but in the context of also providing other services. And in order to do that, we had to start by working with those government administrators that were traveling to the villages to identify landless women who could then be brought into the program and then could then work with both the land issues as well as these broader service issues, including ag extension. And to do that, we helped train something like 8,000 local government officials who then worked with the local partners in these centers to address their issues more holistically, both the social service side but also the land rights side. But finally, I want to mention one other actor that hasn't really made it onto the screen, but I think is really critical here, and this goes against all my political judgment, but I will mention it. Large multinational corporations have a vested interest in rule of law, and that can often serve perverse results if it's just the multinational taking advantage of local law, as I think is stereotypical of a lot of companies, and in many cases the reality. But there's also a broader interest to create stability. And actually, in the case of some of the companies that Oxfam and Landesa have worked with in the past and current, ag companies, large food and beverage companies, for example, and some mining companies have an interest in ensuring that land rights are enforced for smallholders. So we need smallholder farmers in these supply chains. We know that their productivity suffers from lack of land rights. The company should engage on those issues and can be brought into that issue. And so in the case of a campaign that I was involved with in my pre-Landesa days at Oxfam, we got large companies like Coke and Pepsi and Unilever and Cargill to step up publicly and take a public position on land rights for communities and smallholder farmers, and that proved highly effective as a political voice promoting rule of law. And I think this is an opportunity that is too often overlooked because NGOs and others are too skittish and too concerned about work and too unfamiliar to working with companies. And companies just don't recognize opportunities and are also too wary about getting involved in what looks like a political issue. But in fact, we need powerful actors on the side of rule of law, especially rule of law that empowers communities and smallholders. And there are opportunities, I think, to do that if people think creatively on both sides.
And I think we are making some strides in that effort and engaging in partnerships with commercial sector, private sector, and corporations. And obviously there's the corporate social responsibility movement. There's the so-called Ruggie principles and business and human rights. I think much more attention is being given to that.
Just let me distinguish one thing on that, because I've worked in that field for 25 years now. There is a lot of movement on that, including on the Ruggie principles, but the soft side of it is companies do not want to come out publicly in support of controversial issues. And they, for example, free, prior, and informed consent, critical issue for communities. You can't even talk about how you're going to get a level playing field if the community doesn't know that it's secure in its land rights. Companies will say, we respect the right, we'll work on the right, we'll implement the right, we'll do all the right things, but we will not take a public position on the right. And until they lend their political voice to these issues, same with business and human rights, they're all implementing it, they have lots of partners, but they won't come out publicly and say to governments or to the public sphere that these are important issues. So I'm really talking about the political voice. And this is dangerous because companies have a lot of political voice, and usually we're trying to push them back on their political voice. So it's holding them accountable for what issues are they promoting. Are they promoting lower taxes and less regulation, or are they promoting worker rights and rights of communities? publicly. And I think that's the issue that I'm really the nub of it. And I agree with you that I know USAID and others have been very big on promoting companies to do the right thing, but I think sometimes we miss that political side.
Okay, very good. So you've all been very good in participating virtually, and now we would like to call upon you to participate more directly. So it's time for questions. Why don't we take just the 3 questions at a time, and then we'll ask the panelists to engage. So we'll just start here. Sir, you already had 1 question. I want to try to make sure we're inclusive. So anybody else in the back here? Okay, Ambassador Michaels. And then we'll start here, and then we'll go around.
I just wanted to ask the panelists to clarify the difference that I perceive between having a holistic approach in your perspective as you are trying to engage with the whole variety of local actors to understand their perception of what are the problems in the country that they're going to have to address, and that you are going to try to encourage and support their efforts to do so. And holistic programming in which you try to do everything, which I don't think anybody is really advocating, but the way this gets described, it sounds sometimes like you're saying, well, if you're going to address local issues, you have to address all of them. And it seems to me that that's a distinction that needs to be clarified in the discussion today. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And I noticed one of the inputs was what do we mean by holistic approaches? Somebody put up their kitchen sink. And so I think that gets at what you're saying is, when do we have to not be holistic, or what does it mean? What's the scope of it?
You have to know what you're doing, but
Right.
you don't have to do everything.
Okay, so let's move to this side, and then we'll.
I was interested in Benjamin's comment
I'm
about.
sorry, could you introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry, Lynn Hammergren, consultant. I was interested in Benjamin's comment about trying to tease out the effect of individual elements in a holistic approach, which I agree is problematic. I've just been asked to find some random controlled test of one element of a multi-element program, and it's hard to find. But aren't holistic approaches generally, don't they depend on things working together? I mean, isn't there an issue there in terms of how could you say whether the community center worked because perhaps it depended on 3 other things in order to have an impact?
Okay, and then let's get someone from the middle so that they get to. It's hard to see, but this woman with the red dress, I believe.
I really very much appreciated Dr. Jinho's comments about speaking with the court clerks, the file clerks. We found, I'm Ann Goldstein with the International Association of Women Judges. Although we don't have data on an anecdotal basis, we've also found a correlation between missing files and file clerks being paid less than $1 a day. And we've also found that in talking to file clerks, they can be quite open about being sexually abused by judges and other higher-ups. And we've found these conversations to be very interesting. And I'm wondering if Just Track or anybody else on the panel is aware of more empirical research on court support staff and their opinions.
Okay, that's 3. Why don't we tackle them? Just Jinho, would you like to start?
Yes, maybe coming back on the last question. Unfortunately, I am not aware of any more empirical data in this respect. I think your remark and the examples that you provide also for me show the importance of strong leadership at a court level and maybe even throughout the justice sector. I think, one of the things that we focus on at Hill is the importance of justice leaderships. Also starting from the notion that in the justice sector there is no clear CEO who calls the shots, and at the law schools in Europe at least, no single one of them has a course in leadership. Whereas if you would go to a business school or universities that prepare people for a professional career in administration, leadership usually is a thing. It's a thing, it's a concept. We research it, we generate best practices and research knowledge about it, and we teach our future leaders how to effectively provide leadership to their organization. I think in the justice sector, this is something that's really lacking. It's a blind spot. And for these types of situations where people suffer from sexual violence, you need the right type of leadership to create the types of environments where people step up and report these types of cases. And more broadly speaking, I think, getting things done in the justice sector or trying to innovate in the justice sector, you need leaders who will manage the media when they start criticizing, when things don't go completely as predicted, because that's part of innovation. You need strong leaders who are able to manage donors for the same fact. And you need strong leaders who, in the process of transforming from a justice sector where it all depends on strong personalities into a justice sector with strong institutions and strong middle management, you need people, individuals who provide leadership to the staff in order to be willing to go that way. And I think for the professionals in the area of rule of law, leadership and all its soft characteristics probably should become more part of the radar that we're looking at.
Mhm.
I mean, I don't have any answer for this. I mean, yes, you're right. It's that by definition, something that's holistic has multiple components that ideally would be working in conjunction with one another, complementing the work accomplished in the one so that it enhances the work done in the other, making it difficult then to tease out an actual effect of any one component. That said, I still think that as we kind of envision a holistic intervention, we nonetheless understand what the different component parts are, and that, at least in theory, would be able to include something of a sophisticated, or some element of evaluation for each of those components, so that while we look at the whole, even if we aren't able to necessarily tease out the specific effect brought to bear by an individual component, we're able to identify the 4 or 5 that actually proved on their own to be effective in achieving the goals of those respective programs, which can bring us some distance towards being able to say, okay, well, we can't say which of those 4 or 5 were really leading the charge towards accomplishing the thing that we said was effectively accomplished by the larger intervention. But at least we can know that these are the 4 or 5 that seem to pull much of the weight.
If I could just add just one thing. I guess the one thing I would agree there, it would be nice to be able to get rid of the things that didn't have an impact. And a lot of buildings have been credited with things they didn't do because they were in a program where other things mattered.
Anything? Yes.
So maybe just on that question of the kitchen sink versus holistic approaches, I guess there is a danger that as we talk about holistic or systemic approaches, people start understanding that as you have to do everything and then just throw up their hands and let's forget the whole thing and go back to our narrow, linear approaches. And somewhere in between that narrowness and the linearity and the total mess of a kitchen sink approach, I think there is an approach that is workable where you have to start by understanding the system and you have to understand the influences and the relationships and the power dynamics, and you have to look for leverage. And I think as people are trained and gain experience in understanding systems, they can actually pull out the essential elements. And then there's a lot of trial and error. And I think the example from El Salvador is a perfect example of it. You can't go into one of those communities and assume that a Western model, or I should say a U.S. model, is going to work in a violence-prone area where people are suffering all kinds of other issues. And you can't assume that the church is going to know what to do either, or whoever that actor is. But you can find some of the strong actors. You can devise certain pilots. You can innovate. and then you can find pathways that seem to work, and through rigorous monitoring and evaluation, hopefully you can scale up. And I think that's what it looks like. So it's not a kitchen approach, kitchen sink approach. It's not linear. It is understanding, though, having an appreciation for systems and some humility and some agility.
Okay, 3 more. We'll start in the back on the left, and then we'll go across. My left.
Hi, my name is Stephanie. I'm a lawyer with the Public International Law and Policy Group. And with the innovation and the trial and error, how do we act responsibly toward our targets, our target communities, and also guard against discouragement? Because if we're trying a lot of different innovative approaches, it could get a little trying after a while.
Okay, here in the middle.
Hi, my name's Catherine Kelly. I work in monitoring and evaluation at the American Bar Association Rule of Law Initiative. And my question is spurred by some of Chris's remarks in particular about the demand side approach and politics. So it does seem that one thing I often struggle with is thinking about programs, not just from a technical support kind of standpoint, but thinking about the underlying political incentives for the technocrats to behave in a certain way in legal bureaucracies. And so my question is, it seems like, especially if we are working in contexts where the judiciary is not completely independent, even low-level sort of legal appointments might be extremely politicized. And so do you see any benefits of the demand side approach to uncovering information about these political incentives that could then help us address supply side? Or do you think about demand and supply side interventions in a different way in relation to political factors?
Okay. Anybody in this back? One more question. Okay, right here.
Hi, I'm Hadley Rose, and I work with various legal education initiatives in Afghanistan. I'm just wondering if we have some examples or models of actually incorporating non-legal aspects of normative organization of society and incorporating those non-legal aspects into our rule of law programming. Because to me, rule of law kind of means law as we know it as donor countries, essentially. So I haven't seen a lot of successful examples, but I've heard from the panel hints at it. So I'm just wondering if you have any comments on incorporating non-legal principles into rule of law programming.
Okay, thank you.
I have one question for Mr. maybe Joknik. The 2 new things which the government of India is doing, one, giving everybody a bank account, and second, the biometric identification, whereby government subsidy will go directly to the person. How are those 2 small but very important things going to affect positively the rule of law?
Okay, thank you. So how do we act responsibly to our target communities? Are we asking too much of them? For the political sensitivities and issues of supply and demand in judicial appointments at lower levels, perhaps even issues of social accountability, non-legal aspects being integrated into rule of law programming. I often say rule of law is too important to be left to lawyers, so taking a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary approach. And then this question on India biometrics. So, Chris, the last one was directed to you. It was quite specific. You want to tackle that? And then
Yeah, well, I will say I'm by far any kind of an India expert, so it's very hard for me to say on the specifics, but I will make a general comment that I hope would be true. Things like the programs to bring people more into the formal systems like bank accounts or biometric systems are, I think, a step in the direction of building ownership and some investment of those people in rule of law and in the system itself. And so I would hope that those sorts of steps and programs would bring greater demand for more accountability from the government, and would bring people would give people a stake in a system that they may not really feel like they have much of a stake in otherwise. And so I would hope that those would be steps in the right direction more generally for rule of law, but I'd be really wary of going much beyond that because I'm just largely ignorant of a lot of the India dynamic. But maybe I can touch on a couple of the other things quickly by way of closing. On the first question about innovation can get tiring, that is true. Innovation can get tiring, and I do think there's always the risk of building expectations amongst local populations for particular programs, and then they fail, and people are left worse off than before and disillusioned, and rather than mobilizing them and getting them engaged, which is what we ultimately need, you do just the opposite. You demoralize them and make them more cynical. And so I think somehow in the course of looking at long-term programs like rule of law and governance questions, which are multi-year projects, we need to also think about small victories and day-to-day improvements. And so combining larger structural change with more day-to-day progress, I think is critical to getting at some of these questions of how do we think about systems and incentives and bringing actors in. Well, part of the way you incentivize people is you give them you show that their day-to-day lives will actually improve in the short term and not in the long term, which people sometimes have a tough time envisioning. And so I would just offer that as a thought, but I think you touch on a really important question. And one other issue I wanted to suggest an answer to was supply and demand. Are they separate issues? Can we just have some folks working on supply and maybe others working on demand, or are they linked? And I would say they are absolutely linked, and you can't really separate the two. If you're not looking at both sides, I think you're going to miss out. And the demand side absolutely can have an impact on some of these supply side issues. And I know that, and it's, in the last 2 minutes we can't get at it, but there are interesting efforts to find ways with technology and otherwise of getting people more invested in efforts to hold their leaders more accountable at the local and regional and national levels. And things, there are tools that make things more transparent, the kind of polling data and that have been tested in different programs. And those are exactly the kinds of things that I think get us closer to linking an emerging demand and then strengthening those institutions. And you do it by the in-between part has to have a lot to do with greater transparency, greater accountability, that allows people, the ultimate beneficiaries and clients, to have a voice in these sort of programs.
Why don't you just address what you feel most comfortable with?
Oh, sure. I want to continue and extend a bit the answer with regards to, aren't we exhausting our communities, or are we managing their expectations well and not asking too much of them? I think, it's extremely important for me to really give local communities both voice and ownership. And I think building from their justice needs is one way of doing that, having a joint problem analysis so you deeply understand what at a local level the perception of the problems they experience actually is, and make them part of the solution design process, I think is also extremely important for this. So one of the things that we typically do is we bring in people from local communities, and together with them we draft the terms of reference for any program or procedure that we are trying to design. And in addition to that, find ways to continue to collect input from them. Now, one example I would like to give to you is the following. When we conduct these justice needs and satisfaction surveys, we always use tablet computers. And with the GPS that's part of these tablet computers, you can very easily create some kind of a heat map where you show on a simple Google Map interface where the incidence of problems per region, and at a very detailed level, at a street view level, you can do that. Now, one of the things we're doing right now in Mali is to extend that and to create a plugin where people can continuously update the data that they have shared, again using a dumb phone instead of a smartphone, but they can continue to update their legal problems experienced, the effectiveness of the procedures that they've gone through. And in that way, I think we can at least take some small steps perhaps in continuing to giving these people's voice and be responsive to it. And I think it's far from perfect. It's probably not enough, but it's a few steps further than we typically tend to do and are able to do in that respect. Maybe can I ask one clarifying question about the non-legal normative principles and to what extent we are incorporating those? Can you maybe give an example of a principle that you're thinking of?
I'm mostly thinking of the fact that law doesn't operate in every society like it does in this society, and that law isn't always the best way to facilitate change or improve institutions.
Yeah. Okay, so it's I think in that sense, I think what Andrew already mentioned, rather than only taking retributive perspectives, but also focus on more restorative elements, might be part of introducing different types of principles, probably. One perspective I typically use, I find useful here is to focus on, when you talk about conflicts in important relationships between individuals or between individuals and organizations that they create, is the perspective of finding ways to protect the investments that people made in these types of relationships. And one very common, very frequent type of legal problem is wives being left by husbands with 3 children without the husbands providing for any care or any resource to take care of these children, with the result that the children drop out of school, have no perspective or far less perspective. And you can look at that from a very traditional legal normative manner, or you can look at it at a more from a more pragmatic perspective, and just saying, okay, how can we simply get it done that these fathers take some kind of financial responsibility, so at least this mother doesn't have to let these children drop out of school. And I think that's far less normative and far more pragmatic, I think. And I do see that very often that perspective is at least the first step and much more feasible to get done as a first step, as I said. So maybe that's. I hope that gives you some answer to your question. That's how we typically look at these principles. Yeah.
Final thoughts. You want to wrap us up?
Do I want to wrap us up?
I'll wrap us up, and you can wrap up the questions.
I mean, I guess maybe we could talk afterwards. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on sort of the balance between. I mean, I think because in the case of the CARSI initiative, it has a balance of traditional rule of law and preventative aspects, which I think speak to what you're talking about. The question is, what is the balance of those two kind of approaches to addressing the problem, and should we weight the one more than the other? And I don't know that those who have evaluated the CARSI initiative agree that particular effort adequately balanced the sort of non-legal approaches to development and prevention relative to the other aspects.
Okay, thanks. And thank you. We are a little over, but I hope you found this to be a useful conversation. I think we tend to use a lot of jargon in our field. Holistic approaches could be considered a jargon. So I think it's a challenging, on its face, it seems simple and straightforward, but I think it's also, to do this work, to think holistically, and all its ramifications is a challenging one. And I think our panelists did a good job here of identifying the issues and the ways that we can approach this. So please join me in thanking them.
For any who have to leave, I did mention earlier, but you'll see as part of our M&E process that there are evaluation forms in color in your materials. So if you have to leave at any point during the day, please hand them in to our team as you leave. Thank you so
That's
much.
great to hear. Well, I was really happy to hear about your study. Sounds like we should be collaborating.
So are you going to stay in?